We're going to graph a tangent function. So describe the transformation of f of x equals tangent of x to g of x equals 2 tangent of 3x and graph g of x. Remember the period of tangent is pi and that the tangent of x is sine divided by cosine. So first we're going to think about what our tangent of x functions are. If you remember back to the sine and the cosine functions, we would pick our first 5 key points, then we would go ahead and evaluate those. We're going to do the same thing here, but using this table to get us started. Now, our x values for our tangent graph is going to go from our negative pi over 2, which is our first asymptote, to positive pi over 2, which is our second asymptote. And directly in between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, the midpoint, which is what we're going to put right here, is 0. And then if we find the midpoint between 0 and pi over 2, that's going to be pi over 4. So again, directly in the middle would be pi over 4. And directly in the middle of negative pi over 2 and 0 is negative pi over 4. And these are going to be our 5 key points for our tangent graph. Again, always thinking that you're going from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, which are your first asymptotes. You don't necessarily have to memorize these 3. You can always do the midpoints. Some of you might just memorize them. It's up to you how you want to take care of it. Then what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the sine function of these values. So what is the sine of negative pi over 2? So if I find the sine of negative pi over 2, that's negative 1. The sine of negative pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. If you don't know where these numbers are coming from, raise your hand and I'll come around and help you. But it's coming from that unit circle. The sine of 0 is 0. The sine of pi over 4 is positive square root of 2 over 2. And the sine of pi over 2 is just 1. Then we're going to take a look at that cosine function. So the cosine of negative pi over 2 is 0. The cosine of negative pi over 4 is positive square root of 2 over 2. The cosine of 0 is 1. The cosine of pi over 4 is positive square root of 2 over 2. And the cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Again, these values are coming from that unit circle. So what's the tangent of these functions? What's the tangent of negative pi over 2? Tangent is the sine divided by the cosine. So negative 1 divided by 0 is undefined. And it should be because remember we said that's where our first asymptote is. Then if we take negative square root of 2 over 2 divided by square root of 2 over 2, that's going to give us negative 1. 0 divided by 1 is 0. Square root of 2 over 2 divided by square root of 2 over 2 is just 1. And 1 divided by 0 is going to be undefined. Again, we said that this was our asymptote, so that should make sense. Now what we're going to do is use these values to help us in the table to the right. Just like with our sine function and our cosine function, we're going to take whatever's here, this bx plus c, or just bx if that's all that there is, and that's going to be our first key points, which are these right here. So these values are coming in over here. Negative pi over 2, negative pi over 4, 0, pi over 4, and pi over 2. So again, these go in first. Then what we're going to do is we're going to fill in the tangent function. This tangent function is coming from right here, these values that we came up with. So this is undefined. This is negative 1, 0, 1, and undefined. I guess we could spell it out. Now what we're going to do is very similar to what we did with our sine and our cosine functions, is we have to figure out what the x value is going to be. So we're going to take this x value here, and to figure that out, we're taking the 3x and setting it equal to each one of these. So we're going to take 3x and set it equal to negative pi over 2. So if we solve for x, we're multiplying by 1/3 on both sides. So we're taking times 1/3 here times the third here, and we get x equal to negative pi over 6. So that's going to go in here. And then we'll take our 3x and set it equal to negative pi over 4. Multiplying by a third, we get x equal to negative pi over 12. So this is negative pi over 12. Then we'll take our 3x and set it equal to 0. Dividing both sides by 3, we get x equal to 0. And then if we take 3x, set it equal to positive pi over 4, multiplying both sides by that 1/3, we get x is equal to pi over 12. And our last one, take that 3x and set it equal to pi over 2. Multiplying by 1/3 gives us pi over 6. And then what we need to do is we're going to take a look at this 2 in front, which is our amplitude. And that's going to take, in, just like with our sine and cosine function, and multiply everything here by 2. You can't multiply the undefined, so this is going to stay undefined. That's still going to be our asymptote. Then if we take 2 and multiply by negative 1, we get negative 2. Then we're taking 2 and multiplying it by 0, which is 0. 2 times 1 will give us 2. And then our undefined will stay undefined. That's going to be our other asymptote. And from here we can go ahead and graph it. Now before we graph it, we're going to pop right back up and let's just describe that transformation. So what does the 2 do? So just like in our sine and cosine functions, that 2 is going to stretch our graph vertically. So g of x is stretched vertically by a factor of 2. And if we take a look at that 3 inside here, the b value, this is going to compress it horizontally. So compressed horizontally by a factor of 3. So let's go graph this below. Taking a look at our table, we'll kind of go back and forth so we have some room here. So let's draw out a graph for ourselves. And we'll label it. So if we check back up here, we are going from negative pi over 6, negative pi over 12, 0, pi over 12, and pi over 6. So we have here, which is pi over 12. Oops, that should be a 12. Here's pi over 6, negative pi over 12, and pi over 6, negative pi over 6. And we're going up to 2 and down to negative 2. And if we take a look at our graph here, at negative pi over 6, sorry about that, negative pi over 6 and positive pi over 6 were undefined. Those are our asymptotes. So let's start there. So at negative pi over 6 and positive pi over 6, those are our asymptotes. Then at negative pi over 12, we have negative 2. So negative pi over 12, negative 2. Looking back at your table, you should see that you also have the point 0, 0. And looking back one more time, you should see you have the point pi over 12 and 2. And then our graph of our function is going to start down by this asymptote, and it's going to come back around. Let me try that again. So it should look like that x cubed graph if you do it the right way. It's kind of hard with the pen that I'm using on here, but do the best that you can. So again, it's going to come up and down. So really you should be going like this. If you have questions, let me know.